I'm always really excited to be here to talk to UX people as opposed to the many lawyers and legislators. And well, we don't really talk to legislators. We're not a lobbyist, but the legislative advocates and other advocates, because it's always fun to come back to your original community and share some stuff. I said to somebody, well, I mean, what we're doing here at CCD, it's really just regular everyday UX work, just in a new space. And they said, you know, Whitney, you're right, but actually you're doing a lot of things a little differently, and it's because of the space you're in. And so it's kind of fun to talk about it. So this is really going to be a series of little rapid fire case studies around some themes, just to get a sense of what it is. I mean, I could probably talk about what I think is different, but mostly I just think it's the context. And I think I've always thought that when you're in healthcare, there are things that determine how you work. And if you're in government, there are things for that. And if you're doing, you want everybody in the world to sign up, you work differently than if you're doing B2B. And I think this is just part of kind of the maturing of learning how to take the tools that we've used and apply them and adapt them as needed in new environments. Just a little bit of background on me. There are the field guides, but I wrote, my first book was about storytelling, and I think that this has become so important in voting because people think of voting as a series of facts that we need to communicate. But I think that most of what we're doing with design is trying to create a story about how this is easy enough for you to do, this is convenient enough for you to do, this is worth it for you to do, and creating that story in fairly subtle ways, especially because a lot of our work is with election offices. And my third book was A Web for Everyone. And, I thought, of course, everybody should do accessibility. I'm extra, somebody should do this stuff. And then I found myself on a stage at the National Institute of Standards and Technology talking about voting systems and usability with a bunch of technology people, but also some accessibility people. And I said to someone, somebody really had to do something about getting more of this stuff in it. And they said, I think that's you, Whitney. I mean, I think you're there. And I realized that I was working now in one of the 2 or 3 fields that actually gets sued and where people really do take access very seriously. I mean, not that government doesn't take it seriously, not that others do, but, elections is pretty special and it happens on a particular day. And we know that there's some persistent gaps in turnout and among various populations. And one of those is people with disabilities for a lot of reasons you can imagine. The field guides, and just to show you the evolution over time, this is the current color. They stopped making our paper color and we had to switch inks and things, but we have now given these out around the world. They're in all 50 states. In some states, they've gone to every single election office at the request of the state. So they've been really influential in getting people to think about design. The key to them is that there's 2 things. One is that there's been some great research done, and we now have a really specialized technical term for a really good pile of fantastic research reports. We call them a doorstop because no one reads them. And so we started writing shorter things, thinking somebody would read them. This is Dana Tishnell and I, as we were sort of working up to founding the Center for Civic Design. And finally, Dana came up with this idea that I have to admit it, when I first heard it, I thought was the silliest thing I'd ever heard, which is we were going to do these little 20-page booklets with 1 tip on a 2-page spread. It'd be 10 tips on 4 topics to start with. And she was right. She was totally right. It totally took off. And it made us kind of crystallize our views on what we wanted people to do. It is not everything about designing usable ballots. It is 10 things that anybody can do. And they've been used and they've worked. So that was sort of one of our first lessons is they were very happy to have us. They were very happy to learn about this crazy thing we did they couldn't pronounce as use a something ability, right? But that wasn't really their job. And they wanted us just to kind of be there and make it happen. Another group that had a similar experience to that was AIGA's Design for Democracy team, which started in Chicago in that area. And they have a wonderful book, which I think you can still get, called Design for Democracy. And when we tried to get some of the leaders of that group to keep going, what they said is this just isn't a big enough design problem for us, right? That the researchers doing technology research, they were out on the cutting edge of their fields. They're still out on the cutting edge of their field, but really civic design is about applying best practices, the things we know, and doing them rigorously and doing them all the time. In 2008, we got to work on a report with the Brennan Center for Justice, one of the big civil voting rights groups, where a bunch of political scientists looked at unusual events in elections, places where two districts had different ballots and got different results that when you modified for normalized for demographics you wouldn't expect to find. And then we all looked at them and said, what do we think is wrong with the design? And there was a big, this has been influential, it continues to be influential, but Carolyn Jarrett, who's a forms expert, occasionally I would show her the form and I would say, this caused a problem. What problem do you think it caused? And she'd say, I'm not sure. And I would tell her the problem. And she'd say, oh, yes, I can totally see that. Right. So it's about tuning your eye, I think, to the content of the field and having enough hours of looking at things and enough hours of watching people use things and enough hours of struggling with the design things that gives you the sort of tuning to do that work well. And we've already talked about the field guides. And I want to just jump to some work we've been doing on research prototypes, exploring different ways of voting. This one is ranked choice voting, which have been, again, been adopted in part because we didn't try to say we're designing a voting system. We said we're trying to explore the interaction of the ballot marking aspects of a voting system, and we're going to give you a bunch of stuff that you can take for your voting system and put it into the center of that. So thinking about how we interacted with other people in a field where we're not employed by them. So we don't, we can't go to our boss and complain that the developers aren't listening to us or anything. And just because I don't think many people see the whole voter experience, and this is just a little piece of it, it's a pretty broad range of things, right? It's screens that you might be voting on, it's paper ballots you might be voting on, it's all kinds of voter guides, the envelopes in which you get your ballots if you vote by mail, the applications you use, and the notifications that you get, something that we're just beginning to get thinking about, which is all those times they have to send you a note that said, you just registered, or your registration is about to lapse, or we're about to send you something, or here's some other notice, and thinking about all of those and how to make sure that voters understand what they're being sent, because as with any field that's got insiders, there's some insiders. And if you're an insider, this is also all pretty obvious and it's really clear what you're asking the voter to do. But if you're not an insider, if you're just someone who, believes in democracy, believes in voting, shows up to vote, but doesn't think about the mechanics underneath all of that, you might or might not know what this notice that says, help us count your ballot means. In fact, it might sound pretty scary if you got that notice, but in fact, it's a really good thing because it means there was a mistake and we can fix it. And so your vote will count. And how do you communicate those sorts of subtleties in a system that has to work for pretty much any adult over 18 in the country? And we do this by doing lots of research, and what we write are best practice guides mostly. But so we do a couple of projects, we work on some things, we fight our way through things like what are all the US postal system rules for ballot envelopes, and then we try to put it into a format that makes it easier for election officials to not have to fight their way through that complicated bit of information. And so some of this research is like formative, trying to figure out what people need. Some of it is sort of consolidating what we've learned in our projects. And some of it is taking a step into understanding what the science tells us about being able to do things. I'll talk a little bit more about this research report, making ballot envelopes clear and understandable. We have a wonderful guy named Sean Asamo Johnson working with us, who's a linguist, and he's been looking at forms and ballot questions and trying to think about how you can make those intelligible in what's often a very constrained space. And so tackling some of those big problems on a multi-year version. So we've got these sort of layers of work going fast, medium, slow, and slower. And we, of course, spend as much time as we possibly can sitting with people, doing what we all do, which is watching them. We've gone out with the Orange County election folks took us out. We do workshops. We've done all those things. A lot of it, you'll notice, is not in a lab. In fact, most of our work, even if we had a lab, isn't in a lab. It's mostly in a casual space. I don't think I have a picture of this here, but we do a lot of work in DMVs because we were doing voter registration at the DMV. I think that's actually the picture of the guy with his back to us. And we've done a lot of work right outside of elections. So the one on the sidewalk and the one at this table, one is sort of research about something where we could capture people who just had a voting experience about it and then see where that took us. And one was just simply really almost exit interviews, where we were asking people about what they'd done, showing them some things, testing after they'd voted whether this information made more or less sense than it did before. But going what we call go where the people are. Which is thinking about how we can find folks. Oh, and we've already talked about this, so I'm just going to skip right on, except I've said all of this. But why they're important. It's because, especially in government offices, really everyone's a designer. They write notices, they design, they create forms. And there's rarely someone whose job in that office is designer. There might be a communications person, but there's rarely someone who thinks about the interaction with materials. And so we're really trying to not make them into designers, but give them the tools to be a better designer. And we started with sort of these little quick guidelines, but we've quickly moved on to thinking about what tools we can create and give them that gets them a head start on the problem. Because even having someone who's never going to touch the design of the form, but who's in charge of that process, understand what good design might look like for them and how it can help them, means we get better design because people because they ask for it and they start to demand better design and they start to adopt some of the pieces. So our motto is democracy is a design problem. And maybe all of you just went, yes, of course it is, right? Of course it's a design problem because we're all designers, but we spent a lot of time trying to explain just what it is that we actually mean by that. And so I just want to tell a little story about New York in 2018. New York had in 2010 switched to paper ballots from a lever machine, but the state law still says that the entire ballot has to fit on one face because the law was written at a time when lever machines were what voting systems looked like. And so they had a really big election with a lot of things on it, and they needed more than one sheet of paper for it. And so to meet the full face rules, they printed a double-sized card perforated down the middle. The voter was going to have to tear the perforation apart. That's all awkward enough. It was a big election and it rained. So we now have people in a damp room wearing raincoats, holding this perforation, ripping these things apart and putting them into a highly calibrated piece of machine that was going to scan and read it. And you can just imagine what happened, right? What happened was lines and ballots that had to be remade and it was just mayhem. The New York Times said it is as if there was a purposeful plan to make voting as unappealing as possible. And the New York City Board of Elections does not get a lot of props from its constituents. It's a tough market, just to be fair. They have 10 bosses because there's 5 counties in New York City. So that means there's 2 commissioners for each thing. I mean, it's a pretty unwieldy bit of bureaucracy, but this was a big wake-up call. And I'm going to leap forward 2 years and say, this is what it looks like when you actually start to work on the problem. In August of 2020, we got a call from late July, we got a call from the state election office saying, hey, this might be an opportunity to work on some envelopes because we're going to have a lot more people voting by mail and we need to work on it. We'll just put them out as a suggestion. And in early August, I learned, like Juliana's wife from the Daily News, that we had been tapped to actually design the things because there had been an executive order from the governor saying we will have one ballot in the entire state and everybody will use it. And just to put this in context, ballots are normally printed in about March. And it's now about a month from when they have to go out. And so we had a scramble to do it. New York City prints ballot envelopes with 5 languages. The ballot envelope doesn't get any bigger. It's a lot to fit on there. The law was pretty restrictive about what we could change. But here we are on November 10th, which is a few days after the election, with an update from the Board of Elections that says they've received 713,000 ballots and 98% of them are preliminary valid. And of the 4% that are left, about half of those can be fixed if people come in to fix their signatures or whatever else was wrong. This is in contrast with a close to 20% rejection rate in the primary. So that's pretty darn dramatic. And they ended up with a 0.77% rejected ballots. That's still not great, by the way. The national average in 2020 was 0.34. So they're still above the average, but they've come a huge way. And honestly, it was designed, because it wasn't just the design of the envelopes, it was the huge amount of voter education people did, the communications people did around it. But it was the start of their going, oh, wait, maybe this thing actually worked, this design thing, maybe it actually makes a difference. And then after 2020, we worked with Vermont, and they ended up, again, not way down at the bottom, but at 0.4, where they were in pretty good shape, sort of between, not at 1.2 like, or 1.8 like New Mexico, not as good as Rhode Island at 0.02, but in the first post-pandemic using of all vote by mail in the state, it went pretty well. And we love it when we see the Secretary of State sort of saying, yep, and it was because of the work we did. That in that case, it actually included a lot of work with town clerks, because there's a lot of them in Vermont, and making sure that they were ready to deal with this new thing, because the state had really done most of the processing the year before. And when we think about all of this, we're always thinking about context, because each of those states started in a different place. North Carolina is one of the ones I'm proudest of, because it has more words than you can imagine on it, including the voter signature and a witness signature and voter assistance certificate, all of which had legally required words, all of which had to be an envelope that's still no bigger than an envelope. And it did pretty well. We actually do have a terrible mistake on this envelope, which is that we didn't put yellow behind the witness, print your name. And that section was also required. We were also focused on getting the signatures, that we forgot about that. And they did a big voter ed campaign to try to work around it. But one of the things that we keep thinking about is, what's the opportunity in this moment? How far can we push them? How far can they go? Do we have to work within the current law, or is there some opening for us? I mentioned that we're working in Saskatchewan, and because it's this kickoff, actually, not the end of, but the kickoff of a regulatory process, they said, just tell us show us what you think it ought to be, and we'll see how close we can get to that. And after it goes through our process, after it's been through comments, after it's been looked at by legal, they were really open to the idea that maybe we'll put out a design that is farther than they could go, and we'll move towards it. And sometimes you get much closer than you think, when people can see how much better it is than what they had. And what they had wasn't terrible, it just wasn't great, and they wanted to be great, and I really appreciate that. I've mentioned the laws a little bit, but what in the end of this, we think that civic design is really what we call policy made visible, right? It's what voters, or any in any other government service, sees in that trap between what was written in the law, what comes out through the administration to create the user experience. And this is a very American example, but in our National Voter Registration Act, which allows us to register at the motor vehicles office, it also allows people to get registered when they sign up for benefits. And this is what these things tend to look like. It actually looks bigger here than it would on a normal page. I challenge you to find what you should do to say, yes, you want to vote. It's that little yes at the very top, before you've read everything else, buried in the text. And it turns out, sadly enough, that all of this text is in quotes in the law, which means that it must be quoted exactly. And when we started working with some of the advocates and saying, wouldn't you back us on a few changes? And they said, nope. And I said, why not? We're so good at this. And they said, no, we won't, because if we back you on a change and we trust you, that's great. But the next person we might not trust as much, or we might actually be in opposition to, and we can't open that door even an inch until someone can get this truly changed. And so we said, well, okay, well, fine. Let's see what we could do to make this look a little better. This is what we proposed for something. These are all the same words, except for these two that explain what yes or no means, which got axed immediately. Just ripped right out of there. But nonetheless, it's still better. In this thing, it actually has the yes nos of all the other questions in that same position. Other places also spread text out. It's not a clean column, so we felt okay to do that. We actually suggested that in the final one, we move this, you may fill out, to the next line, so we could just make it fit. and not column, but all of a sudden this begins to look like we rearrange the things you need to know before are before, the question is in the middle, the boilerplate is at the end, and we got them to actually blow in to the back of the thing in the very last page. There's an actual voter registration form. So you don't even have to know, because what happens if you say yes is not that you get registered to vote, but that they mail you a voter registration form. Right. And so we got them to put the voter registration form in the very same thing. And they did put a note about that it being on a later page. We wanted it at the back so they didn't have to shuffle through a lot of things. And we got the back position. So it's that negotiation around the policy, the thing, they're going to, when they print this, I don't think they've done the print yet, they're going to print 2 years worth of these booklets. And so that's going to be it. Right. And for 2 years, if we're not right, we're right. We're not right. But getting that far, it was such a huge win. It took sort of 2 years of waiting and pushing for that to happen. In the middle of all this thing, we have to talk about literacy, not just civic literacy, but reading literacy, because I think that's at the core of all of it. I think it's more important than the design. It's why so many of the folks we work with have experience writing for low literacy people or linguistics or things. And the reason why this matters is because 43% of the people in the US read at basic or below basic levels. Don't get smug, Canadians. This is actually true across the Anglosphere. It's not an indictment of the education system. It's because not everybody really learns to read proficiently. These are people who can read, right? We're not talking about illiteracy, but we're talking about the degree to which you can draw inferences from what you've read. How simple and how concrete does this have to be for you to be able to take information in through your eyes and do something with that information, draw an inference from it. And so that's almost half the population, and yet we write these things to them as though they're all lawyers, right? That's at 13% at the top end. And just beginning to think about the fact that it's not about talking down to someone just like plain languages, and it's about talking clearly about the thing they need to know. And I'll show you lots of examples as this goes through. But I want to come back to that paper I mentioned that Sean wrote. He took 26 absentee ballot envelopes, and he took the oath off the back of it because the voters signed something that says, yes, I'm me and I know all the rules of voting. And he ran them through a readability test. Now, we don't think readability actually tells you if it's readable, if it's actually usable, but what we wanted was a linguistic analysis, just how complicated is this text itself, just that much. And it's pretty bad, right? Of them, they're all on the postgraduate level. And then we did some work, which I'll show you in a second, and we retested them the same way. And you can see that that curve has just shifted. Now, the words you've chosen to pick, all the rest of the things that make that text actually useful is a different question. But just some manipulation of the language gets you on that path. So here's an example of one. That was how it was printed on the envelope, except in the much smaller text. It is Georgia. There's a fun story at the end of this. And it's postgraduate 178 words. I mean, it's just bloody hard to read. I'm a citizen of the United States and of the state of Georgia. I possess the qualifications of an elector. I mean, this is not simple stuff. And so we started with our magic trick, which is adding bullets, right? So just taking all the semicolons and breaking it up. Already no text change, but it starts to bring that reading level down because it's done the chunking for you. It's broken it up into the pieces and you can begin to see it, but it's still, not great. And, oops, I'm sorry, did I just go in the wrong direction? I think I did. And so we started to think about how can we simplify that text, right? I'm a citizen of the United States. We kept reside just to, sort of exploring with that. At the address where I'm registered to vote, we started beginning to simplify it, taking the I understand out of the bullets. And we're now coming down to upper primary reading level because we're using just plain up simpler words. And what's fun, I guess I don't actually have it in here, but this is the final text. So we ended up being able to work with the Secretary of State of Georgia's office to update their envelopes for their new law. and that there were a bunch of little changes they had to make. And I said, can we change this at all? And they said, we can actually. It's not in quotes. It says it has to be substantially the same. This is my favorite word now, substantially. And the chief counsel of the Secretary of State's office let us push pretty hard. They pushed back at reside versus live. I mean, it was a legalism. I didn't win every battle, but it's a heck of a lot better. And it's down in, a kind of level of reading that people can do. And we've gotten rid of some of the terrible, terrible words. But this is what I think it ought to look like. Is this. Right? I mean, let's get down to the what am I actually agreeing to and what are you actually telling me? And one day, there are some states that are almost that simple. But that, I think it's really easy to be proud of that big shift. But like, this is where we're really aiming for, is that kind of just absolutely clear statement. But if, literacy is also more than reading, right? There's how much do you know about voting, about how your government works. Ginny and Dana did some testing of ballots many years ago. And one of the big issues was the difference between a state senator and a US senator, right? So all of those, all of those levels of government things. And thinking about what those gaps are, right? Demystifying the act of voting and, getting things into plain language. And then taking the sometimes voters who have the mechanics down. They know where they're going. They know that, what they're doing, but they still need clear information about candidates, what they're voting on this time, and as new options come in. And then those every time voters, how do we give them enough information that they can be an influencer, to use the modern word, right? Because they're often the people that their friends and family come to. How can we encourage them to be role models, not directly, but indirectly? And just make it something that they can do. We did a diary study, and one of my participants was a 45-ish person who had never voted before her 10-year-old daughter made her. And in our final interview, she said, I've done this twice now, and I feel like I'm finally getting the hang of it. And I said, why hadn't you voted before? And she said, when I could first vote, I just wasn't that interested in it. And then years went by and I just didn't think I was like that smart to be able to vote. And then I just never got started. So it's sort of about this habit. And that became this wall that until her 10-year-old basically dragged her down the block and her neighbor ran for school board, she would never have voted. For no particularly good reason, because she did care about her community and she cared about what was going on in her community. She was, middle-ish class and, had lived in the same house for a number of years. So was that stable? So those kinds of barriers are really knowledge barriers. And, when you give someone an overwhelming form and say, hey, you want to vote, fill this thing out first, it's a little hard to see how they're going to get there. In our research, we have a little collection of things in that are civic literacy gaps, like registering for vote doesn't sign you up for jury duty everywhere anymore, that you may or may not need an ID to vote, that you don't have an appointment. We had a new citizen who had skipped voting, although she very much wanted to, because in her country, the card that they mail you, you have to bring with you, and she'd lost hers, couldn't find it, and didn't realize it was just an information card that told her where a polling place was. And so had failed to vote in an election she was ready and getting ready to do. So that's those sad stories. My favorite was working. We were in a benefit social services center, and they had a tech room that people could come to, and they had a group of people who were on their way out of jail, and they weren't allowed to have computers in their halfway house, but they would come here. And this woman was sort of excited to do it. She's interested if she's going to be able to vote again soon. And the question was, what party do you want to be in? And I said, I love any party. It's like, and I realized, yep, we're having a different conversation than something about politics. So just even those sorts of things can be confusing. I think she was having me on actually, but still, it was a funny moment. The other is that people don't want us to tell them what the law is. They want to tell them what they need to know so they can do something, right? To quote Ginny, this is reading to learn to do. And the thing you're looking at is when California created what they called conditional voter registration. It's really same-day registration. There were all these sort of rules about what should you do if in that 15-day period between the close of conventional registration and election day. And so we started to say, if you're already registered, do nothing, just show up and vote. right? If you're not registered to vote, here's where you go, and here's what's going to happen. If you're registered in another county and you've moved, now here's what you do. If you're registered in the same county but you've changed addresses, now here's what you do. And it just became this flow chart of, what condition could you be in if it's conditional, and what is the action you take, and it worked a whole lot better. Another one is voter guides. We've actually created these. These are actually 1/4 of a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. This is one side of it. And you put it together and you've got this little thing that folds up into what we call a pocket guide. And one of the things we did, and it was because we had so little space, we just started cutting as many words as we could, right? We just hacked at words. And so instead of saying things like, these are your options for this, it's like we have a little intro sentence like, you can return it in person to your election office at a secure ballot drop box, right? So it became very telegraphic. And once you'd gotten to the point where it's like how to return your ballot, you now have these phrases, not even full sentences, but basically verb noun phrases to let you sort of see what you can do or where you can do it. And they've worked really well. We've kept doing this. One was actually done for a project called Healthy Voting that was mashed up public health information with voting information in 50 states, in actually all 55 states and territories in 2020. We have one that we did this year for accessible voting, did last year, and we're updating for this year on accessible voting, that adds in extra information around the edges that is relevant for voters with disabilities. And then we can think about how we deliver that information. Is it all at once, or does it come in the famous, as Leslie O'Flavin said, bites, snacks, and meals, right? Just the question, what's on your ballot? Maybe, this is from California, where they vote on a lot of ballot measures. There were 17 on one ballot recently. And so we started with the fact that they actually get 2 voter guides, not one, but 2. One is from the state, and it's everything that is state level, and one is from your county, and it's all the county level and where your polling place is, and all of the local measures in the state are in the county guide. And we couldn't change words, but we did realize that they collect for and again, people who sign up to be position paper for or against the measure. And we created this sort of opening page, which is kind of, okay, we're voting on something, here's the opening for it. And when we got into the text of the arguments in the text, because they're given word counts and it had to fit on the page, the text started to get a little smaller, a little more crowded. But what we found was that, having seen this overview, people were much better equipped to now go in and read text that we had no control of, to be able to say, right, here's what it says on the ballot, this nasty stuff about a California Parapolitical Practices Commission. What does yes and no mean? Who's for it? And it turned out the who's for it was a big tell for people. They looked at who they were and began to think about it. And then they could get into the details of the measure without getting totally confused, because they had some idea what it was about already. So that could have establishing a context and taking them in. I will tell the story. We have a few minutes. We pulled this is from our prototype voter guide, and we pulled it because we figured that deciding what kind of ethics commission you were going to create was about as obscure as we could get. And we had a couple others that weren't quite so obscure. And we were in a community center, and there was a woman who was working in the kitchen, and she sort of sidled out and said, "So can I do this thing? Can I do it too?" And we're like, "Yeah, of course." Turned out she had just registered to vote. She had I think she had a child in high school, and was busy living and getting through life. But she said, "I'm a mom, and this is something I should do. This is like being an adult. I'm going to do this." And she gets to this local ballot measure, and she just gets into the arguments for and against, and her eyes get a little wide and scared. And I said, "Do you want to just move on?" She said, "Oh no, because this really was on her ballot." And she said, "I've never heard of this, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to show up on the nightly news, is it?" And I said, "No, probably not." So I said, "Take the time you want." She took about 10 minutes. She went back and forth, reading it. And she finally said, "I have a decision now. I know how I would vote." And I just thought, yep, she's going to be a great voter. So that entry and that I can do it, and that sense of being able to take that next step is really critical. You've seen some envelopes, but this is a part of our suite. This is for a county that, a state that has an internal envelope. So you put the ballot in an envelope, you sign the form on the back, you put that inside another envelope and you mail it. And we started using things like how you use color. We stole the basic design from a couple of counties that had very similar design, but all blue envelopes are going to a voter. All the other envelopes are going back to the election office. There's some reasons why you might have multiple colors. On the outgoing envelope, the one they get, the one they don't have to give back, on the back, we put information about how to return your ballot. Because if they don't have an insert and they can just print it on the envelope, they've just saved themselves the weight of a piece of paper and the cost of a piece of paper. On the back of the envelope, or even on the envelope, we will put it up here. We have when you have to do it, what the deadline is, and these little do you things, which are like the three or four things that can disqualify your ballot as the final check. And sometimes we've done the orientation of the envelope both ways, but we really like this sort of short one because we can get, it gives us a better shot at good line lengths in the field standing out, and frankly making all of this legal boilerplate just a little blockish. And then this nice sort of box where you have to sign. In many cases, this name and address thing will actually be covered up with a label that's been stuck on, so it's already been applied and they actually don't have to fill it out. But thinking about this envelope as a machine, right? It's got to get through postal. It's got to get through the election office. It's got to get through the mailing house. It's got to get through postal to get to the voter. It's got to get back to the election office. And then it has to get, counted, opened and counted. Having the county name on the back of it was because one county in California said to us, nobody's going to turn it over to see which county it's from. Right? If you're part of the team sitting there opening envelopes. So if we have our county name on the back, then if you see the wrong county, you can put it in the pile to be shipped, because they will send that ballot to the correct county to count it. So really thinking about that process all the way from getting the data out of the voter registration database all the way to opening that envelope to count. The other thing we're always trying to do is sort of move voters through time, because for a voter, elections are very episodic. Even a single election is very episodic. In 2021, do I have that right? Yeah, 2021, New York City had their first ranked choice voting election. It was a primary election. It happens so every odd year. And introducing a new way of voting to a city as big and as complicated and speaking as many languages as New York is not a joke. The campaign finance board is separate from the Board of Elections, and they are responsible for the basic voter information. And they started really early because they wanted to try to figure out whether they could reduce the amount of paper in the voter guide that they have to mail out and move it into other formats, and also begin to move people online. The conventional wisdom was that people do not like online voter guides, but that's because many of the online voter guides were a PDF of the print voter guide. So of course you don't like the online voter guide. It's not an online voter guide. It's just online delivery of a thing that you now have to pay to print out. And they were pretty serious about trying to make a really good website. And we helped a lot, but they did amazing work. One of the first tests of ranked choice voting that we did started with this sort of, here's the postcard. They started with postcards, thinking about, we'll start with that bite. There's just a little bit of information. Ranked choice voting is here sort of a funny thing, because most people had forgotten that it had been voted on 2 years before in a ballot. Nobody remembered that. And then they had both the print version of the voter guide and the online version of the voter guide that had the same content. And then you could, once you got there, dig down into these detail pages that were all very modular, really beautifully designed with that detail. And so things like the key dates could show up in different formats on the website. It could be plopped into a page, but it was very consistent. It moved people through it. And we did a usability test of the early versions of some of these. And the question was, when did they begin to say, yes, I think I understand ranked choice voting? And so we showed them the postcard, and then we showed them web page 1, and we showed them web page 2, and we talked to them in between to try to understand what was happening and what it took for them to get to the point where they could say, yeah, I think I can actually understand this. Some people never loved the idea. Some people glommed onto it right away, but it was really interesting thinking about that journey and how many having similar but connected but not the same information in a couple of stages. We saw a very small town in Minneapolis introduce ranked choice voting, and they didn't have a lot of budget for it, but they decided that they would have one touch point every month leading up to the election in the 12 months, and they, increasing in intensity. And they would use existing things. So they got stuff into school materials, they got stuff into the town newsletter, and they ramped up again from a small thing to a large thing and did a lot of demo elections and, visiting community groups. But the idea was that by the time they had to vote, they'd been sort of taken through this process over time. So if they missed one, it wasn't critical, because they were going to get another shot at it, and thinking about how all that fits together. The other thing that we've done a lot is think about those letters and notice and how they themselves are a micro journey. Like, I get something in the election office. Why am I getting this? Oh, some of them would start with, "You have a problem." At which point, your amygdala turns on, your amygdala has turned on, and you're nothing but scared, right? And so how can we take them through that? And we created this as a kind of structure for any document, right? That you could take it, your voter registration is missing a signature, but we can fix that. Here's what you have to do, right? Same sort of thing. And putting, the action at the bottom, how do you get more information clear, taking them through this sort of really consistent little journey. Works pretty well. So there you go. It's been fun thinking about that. I do have enough time. Great. So as we've worked over the last 20 years, the problems have gotten more interesting because they're more complicated, because we've solved some of the things. And I want to do a quick little case study of something I did last year for a November pilot election. We actually did a live pilot of new technology in a real election. It took a lot of setting up to make that happen, but I think the world is beginning to discover, the election world, that you don't want to design something, go through a big testing phase to certify it, and then launch it, because the real test of it is, can it get through an election? There's no way to simulate that. And so they're beginning to think about how you do pilot elections. It was in a very small town in a small county in Idaho. If any of you have seen Napoleon Dynamite, it's the home of Napoleon Dynamite. And the way we did it, it was one precinct in a 2-precinct polling place. Voters were offered an equal chance to vote on it. Their ballots were counted by the test system, but they were then hand counted at the election office to be the official results. So it was very carefully worked out. We had about 111 people, which is about half the voters in that precinct, in that district, came to vote. So here we go. It was something that's called Election Guard, and it is homomorphic encryption applied to elections so that voters can test that the ballot they cast was counted as they cast it. And the thing on the side is the kind of explanation that had been going on, because at that point there was, the communication challenge was hard, but let me be really clear how hard the technical challenge was. Incredibly hard. They're still working on it. It was, we just were hoping that we would get through the day without things collapsing on us. And we did have a little technical glitch, but this was the kind of stuff they had. Now, Benedita, who's an election technology person, said, look, everything else we've done in elections is really just pushing the same stuff around until we can make it work. But this is a real injection of what to elections is brand new technology. The encryption they're using is actually pretty old, which is actually good because it's very mature and we know a lot about how it works. But if you go to electionguard.vote, you see this sort of thing. And we got asked to do the research on, we went out to Idaho, took a whole team. We did exit interviews, we did observations in the polling place, and we got to write all the communications materials, including the poll worker training. And this is what we came up with. We didn't try to describe the technology at all. It's a pocket guide, so it's a 4-fold, right? It's a 1-page folded twice. I might even have one sitting right here. If I was clever, I would have gotten it out. Yeah, this is what it actually looks like. It's a piece of paper. I can open it up. And we made a cut in it, and this is the pocket that actually is used, and it's got some FAQs on the back. And we did not describe the technology at all. We just told them what it does, which is that with Election Guard, you know your vote counted and have independent verification that the election results are correct. We tested versions of that message in advance. We'd been doing it for about a year working on things, but we sent a team out to test sort of the main points that were going to be in this guide. So we had pre-testing of it, which was how the amazing project manager actually got everybody to actually say yes to this stuff. The I voted sticker is actually the real I voted sticker glued onto the front. So now instead of piles of paper and stuff, the poll workers had this one cute little thing to hand them to it. And they opened it up and said, the machine's going to give you a slip. You're going to want to save it and put it in here. And one of our metrics was how many of these little things ended up in the trash between at the exit to the polling place. And the answer was none. And then we stood around outside. Oh, here it is opened up. You can see the confirmation code. What happens is you take this code back and you can check it. They're now moving on to the polling place. But it had quite a lot of information here, all buried in some very simple words. There was a website that explained, if someone wanted to know what that technology was, there was some relatively simple explanations of it that would link up and up into the more deeper and more complicated thing. And that's what did it. It snowed that day, so it was a good thing that things fit in the pocket. After, as people left, we had three people in the lobby of this community center grabbing. We actually got 112 people that we interviewed. So we interviewed people that had and had not used it because it had been in the town paper. It had been discussed. They'd gotten a letter in the mail from the election office that we helped write. And interestingly, we came off with a strong impression of the technology. This was a pretty red county. My favorite was someone who said, it's good that people are actually starting to try things to fix something instead of just complaining about it. They got how it worked. They were able to give us an accurate enough explanation back of what was happening. And it was more successful than we thought. And I'm going to claim a lot of that on how carefully we prepared the communications. So there's that thing. Jean Erdman, who's a modern dancer, she was married to Joe Campbell of Hero of the Thousand Faces, used to say, you create complexity by layering simplicity. And it has taken all of my strength to get all of the incredibly brilliant technologists to understand that the most important thing isn't that people understand their work, but that people feel confident that they can participate in it. And then maybe they want to know a little more. But that's been my sort of thing. I'm going to do this really fast and just not tell a lot of stories because I know we're right at the end, which is thinking about how you make information visible. These are deliberately sort of blurred so you can't see the text, but you can think about how each page actually looks different, even though they're not quite in focus, right? That one is showing you, they're showing you different kinds of things and doing that, because otherwise that book is just a wall of words. We started thinking about forms and how people see that first field and they just start filling it out. So we put the titles on the side, we put the little help prompts on the side, so that if you thought you knew what you're doing, you could just go right through it, but there's help right there. And we spent a lot of time figuring out how to make that accessible because they have to be, right? These are all put out on the web. We've talked about the pocket guide. Here's just another review of that. Virginia is, I think, still using it, but for certainly at least the last 6 years they have, and they use it. They actually take the frames and they use those in social media. So they're getting a couple of different ways of using it coming out of that. And we have a template out there that anybody can use. So we're seeing them get sort of carried around the country. Visual explanations are so important because you could write everything you want about how there's 4 different envelopes and you have to put them inside each other, but just showing that there's multiple envelopes being stuck inside and ending up at a mailbox or a drop box really helped. But one of the things that happened with these, which we made, if you remember the naked ballots in Pennsylvania in 2020, this was part of trying to adjust to this. We worked with the Secretary of State's office on it. They translated it into all the languages, and then a community group that we were working with gave those things out to a bunch of local artists, paid them to do it, to make these beautiful posters, which they did in all the languages. And they just make my heart sing, because first of all, it's the first time I've seen this kind of work done where the explanation is really accurate because it's been vetted by counsel. It really is what has to happen, but they're also beautiful and personalized and culturally adapted. And then here we are in Erie, Pennsylvania, and the Secretary of State had actually printed out, had made posters of this with some of their pandemic money, and mailed them and shipped them to all of the election offices, and they did actually get put up in the windows, right? We did the pictures. They laid out the thing in their style, and that meant that information was sort of everywhere you could return a ballot, so it gave you a chance to do it right. And then the last thing that was, this was from Kenosha, but for everywhere where there's a drop box, is taking our did you checklist, that things that could invalidate your ballot, and putting it on the drop box. We actually did these with bumper stickers because it turns out that you can buy those really easy from any print shop, and they're waterproof. And got them to stick them on, like wherever, if you open the lid to stick it in, or right on top of it, but where you're staring at this just before you let go of your ballot and can never get it back. So thinking about that journey all the way to letting go of it and beyond. And with that, thanks for sticking with me.